or I'm really pleased to have Professor Thomas Hahn visiting from the Stockholm Resilience Center. He's an associate professor and an environmental economist. I think, if I didn't put you in the wrong box.
It's okay.
But I also asked Thomas, of course that's wrong, but it's okay. I also asked Thomas if he would give a little introduction to himself at the beginning of the lecture. So Thomas, please.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Nice to be here. And yeah, I will start with a lecture for 1 hour and then it's a break. But during the lecture, I want you to interrupt. And if you don't, I will point at you saying, what do you think about this? Because economics is a philosophy. And philosophy means discussing and re-evaluation. So it's really about discussing. It's about arguments. So it's not about facts or science like you're used to. So to understand economics, you have to appreciate that it's about philosophy. It's science about what is good quality of life. And of course, there's no simple answer to that. Matt said that I was an environmental economist. Actually, there is one international society for environmental economics, and there's one for ecological economics. And the latter is only 30 years old and started as a reaction to environmental economics. So you were wrong. Yes. So in June, I was in Helsinki. No, in Turku, in Finland. It was in Finland at least, for the conference for the European Society for Ecological Economics. So now you wonder, what is the difference? Well, the difference is that environmental economics is quite mainstream when it comes to how they do science. So they just use the ordinary neoclassical economics and they apply it on the environment. So they think about resources in a very conventional way. Whereas ecological economics is interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary. A lot of borrowing from other sciences. And today I will talk about a little bit of different things, some favorite things. Fly over the World Economic Forum, where the global elite meets every year in Davos, and say, okay, what do they understand of these things? And then talk about the new macroeconomic model that is emerging. And this is this discussion, green growth or sustainable growth, as we say in the European Union. Degrowth or A growth, what is that? Sustainability transformations. And then at the end, valuation of ecosystem services and commodification of nature. Maybe you got a paper by me on that topic. It's a very big discussion. So first, so here is ecological economics. It actually draws on many disciplines. It of course draws on the neoclassical environmental economics. That's my background, my master's degree. At Ultuna, agronomist. And when you study economics at the Natural Science University, like SLU, Agricultural University, then of course you study agricultural economics and environmental economics. So then I was teaching for 10 years in environmental economics, and I was more and more dissatisfied with the narrow view. So then when ecological economics actually came, just at that time, I mixed in more and more of the ecological economic stuff. But it's quite similar. I mean, it draws a lot on these things, but it also draws on ecology and the laws of entropy, the thermodynamics, institutional economics and political science, everything that is about sustainable development. Okay, so that's the subject, ecological economics. We have a course here. I actually give a course at this department at the bachelor's level. It's in Swedish, so it's not. You can ask your young siblings if you have any, if they speak Swedish. We have 40 students every year, and a long queue. World Economic Forum. That's where the world leaders meet from business, from politics. They fly in with the helicopters and they fly in with the private jets, and they talk about sustainable development. It's the biggest topic. And Johan Rockström, my former boss, he's been there for the last couple of years, and he says, it's incredible. They talk so much about sustainable development all the time. Yes. Because they are intelligent. And they do this global risks report every year. This is from last year. This is based on 1,000 experts, what they think are the worst risks in terms of likelihood to happen and the impact. If it happens, what is the impact? So then you can understand that the worst risks are those up in the right corner. And when you look at them closer, you see that they are actually ecosystem-based. Extreme weather events, whatever that is. I mean, that's about climate. Natural disasters, well, the climate could be something else. Also, failure of climate change mitigation adaptation. Man-made environmental disasters. Biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, water crisis, food crisis. Of course, that's also related to climate and ecosystems. So all these things. And then we have some other things that are not related to ecosystems. So it's fair to say that the global elite, they completely understand this discourse that you take on this course. The discourse of this course. So it's not like,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Is large-scale involuntary migration, is that an environmental?
Yes, you could say that too. The last wave we had of involuntary migration in Europe was based on war and collapsed states, like in Syria and Iran, Afghanistan. So of course, there could be different things, but in the future, this might be due to climate change. You can't. When I was a student, that was a long time ago, there was a lot of ignorance from the elite, regardless if it was the political elite or the economic elite. And when we talk about these issues, I was in a student environmental group. We were called the Green Khmers. You know what Khmer? Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I had to look it up. What are the Khmer Rouge? And then I realized, oh, okay, they are the real terrible communist terrorists that took over in Cambodia and killed everyone, killed all the academics. Okay, so why did they call us Green Khmer when we're talking about, hey, we have a common responsibility to look after these things? But that was the attitude among many people. Of course, our vice chancellor was a nice guy, so he invited us, and we had a very good discussion about these issues before the first Rio conference, 92. At that time, I think a lot of things happened in Sweden and many other countries, but Sweden was very happy about the first conference. So things started to move. At the global level, I think it actually happened in 2010. Because before 2010, everything was about the standard neoliberal politics. Oh, asset price collapse, slowing down of the Chinese economy was a problem. Less than 6%, oh, that's a problem for the global economy. So it was very much standard economic problems. Oil and gas price spike. What happened in 2011? How come the global elite just suddenly changed their mind and put meteorological catastrophes, hydrological catastrophes, biodiversity loss, and climatological catastrophes as the worst global risks? What happened? Was there a new IPCC report? Or was Johan Rockström at Davos? I don't know. I actually don't know. I honestly don't know. But something, it was a tipping point here in the awareness in the global elite. So from that time, I call it the beginning of the biosphere era, when people understand that we belong to the biosphere. It's a very, very thin layer of life around the world, and we are beginning to make it really bad. Just to show you that since 2011, this has actually continued until last year. So there is continuous awareness of these issues. We don't have to convince the global elite that these things are important anymore. But where is the action? Okay, they understand the problems that we discuss in this program, but where is the action? Well, we have the Paris Agreement, but it's based on voluntary action and commitment. So we don't yet see a transformation. And this is a very sad thing. I'll come back to this. Economics, in the view of ecological economics, is about human well-being. People need to move out here. They need to have enough resources to meet the social foundation for a good life. They need food, water, some income and health, and gender equality and energy. Some things don't cost money, like these things perhaps, but so it's about politics and basic means of living. But then we should not transgress the planetary boundaries, the environmental ceiling. So the safe and just space for humanity is here in the light green area. That's what economics should be about. Human well-being is the goal. Economics provides the tools to help us allocate jobs and allocate goods and services. And then, of course, the market is a wonderful mechanism for decentralized decision-making. Market economy is something different from capitalist. Capitalist is about the ownership and how decisions are made by investments. Market economy is about allocation of the consumers. And usually market economy goes hand in hand with capitalism. But then, of course, capitalism is a tricky word because it can mean many different things. Is Sweden a capitalist country? Yes, by all means. Was Sweden capitalist even under Olof Palme? Have you heard of Olof Palme? No? Okay, he was a prime minister like 30 years ago before he was killed. He was very socialist-minded, and Sweden was much more socialist at that time. But still, it was a capitalist country. It was very different regulations on business, what business could do, what business could not do. But then we had the neoliberal era for the last 30 years, which has totally changed the roles of capitalism. So now it's big business who decides what the politicians can do. So it's very opposite. Anyway, economics provides the tools to help us organize things, and the biosphere is a foundation. It's a necessary foundation because we all depend on ecosystem services. Otherwise, we cannot live. This little layer of biosphere. So this should be chapter 1 in economics. It's not. Chapter 1 in economics, well, 70 years ago it looks like this. You have the households here, they provide the labor and they also invest. The rich people can invest in capital in firms. They produce goods and services. And then they pay wages and they buy goods. Fantastic little neat system. So this is how the macroeconomic model looks like. In a more realistic worldview, we must add the voluntary unpaid work, mainly by mothers, but also fathers. And of course, bringing up children is the most important unpaid job in our economy. And adding the whole society. It's quite nice to have rule of law, democracy and freedom, good institutions. Without these things, you don't have a good economy. And finally, the biosphere. If we don't have these things, we don't have a good economy either. So you can see this is also unpaid work by the biosphere. And then you can add the thermodynamics on top of this. So this is a more realistic picture of the economy, according to ecological economists. But you don't see this picture in the textbooks. It still looks like this. And I don't know how are they factor systems? The authors of economics textbooks at the universities. I mean, you studied economics at university. Yeah, it looks like this still. It's quite terrible. I just wonder, are they totally ignorant about what happened in the last 50 years? There's actually a book called Economics as if the last 50 years actually happened. And then it's a book with saying that you have to change the basic model to understand the dependency on nature. So the problem is, tomorrow's economists do not get the adequate training to handle these global risks that even the global elite are talking about for the last 8 years. They can't address the real economic issue. The real economic issues is this donut economics, how to make sure that moving people up here to the social foundation, so people don't get starving and having this extreme poverty, which is so unnecessary. when we have a world of well-being. And then make sure that the economy stays out here. And then you can actually have some economic growth if you can prove that the economic growth will not make the whole system out here. But that's up to you. I say that to the Minister of Finance, that I don't mind economic growth if you can show me that this will not cause the whole system to bounce up here. But that will be very difficult. Yeah, okay, it's up to you. But if you want economic growth, then you must respect the borders set by the thermodynamics and so on. And when it comes to the social foundation, it's quite nice to see that ending hunger for all, it just means 3% extra global food supply. And ensure electricity for all will just increase with today's energy mix, 1% extra emissions. So we'll have to reduce emissions by 81%, not instead of 80%. And income as well. So from Kate Raworth, who is an economist at Oxfam, and she wrote this fantastic book, Donut Economics. Yeah, she is working in development economics and ecological economics. To achieve these things, we need a new system. Yes, please. Yeah.
Right. So does it mean like we have an end number ball? You said 3% more. Like everyone has still as much as they have, and only the people can get over the other ones that have nothing. So it's not really more like the whole today for everyone.
Yeah. As you say, this means if everything else is equal, then we need 3% extra food to feed everyone. But then in the whole global debate, as you know, is about food waste now. And it's about obesity, when you eat the wrong food, and you eat too much food, and the wrong stuff. So of course, with better distribution and with less waste, we don't have to produce more. So it's the same thinking as here. So you're right. But it's good to have the numbers. I mean, 3% extra to feed everyone who's hungry. It's like 800 million people who are hungry. It's quite a failure of the human society, of the global society. To meet these global SDGs, we have to have a new economy, new macroeconomic understanding. Because as we are doing economic progress today, while we do economic progress, we also transgress the planetary boundaries. Here measured as ecological footprints. It's not the best. It's not the exact way to measure overshoot, but it's one approximation when you translate consumption to some kind of hectares on the planet, and it's a bit. It has the problems, but it's based on Wackernagel's research. So when you increase the Human Development Index, which is a reasonable, acceptable index for human well-being, many African countries, especially, are still up here. They should need to go here. But it seems like when you go to the right, you also go up. And then here is one planet, here's 2 planets, and here 3 planets. Or yeah, it's global. It's footprints per person. So there seems to be no country in here. So there's no country on the world having sustainable development when you meet the social foundations without transgressing the planetary boundaries. It's quite depressing, isn't it? It would be nice if it was a lot of countries in here with different economic and political systems. That would be quite nice. They could serve as models. I think Costa Rica is quite close. I mean, there's too much oil in Costa Rica, but otherwise they're doing quite nice things. Also, Vietnam is quite close to this corner. Cuba is also quite close, but the argument is that it's not by choice they are sustainable. It's by necessity, because they've been boycotted by the United States for a long time, and then after the Soviet Union collapsed, they were quite, nobody wants us. So they have to be self-reliant, grow their own food and do their own stuff, and no oil, etc. And they still have quite high literacy. They don't enjoy all political freedoms, as we're used to here in Sweden. But as they measure these things, They don't talk about political freedoms in this measure. They come quite close, come quite high. But the problem is that there are no models at the counter level, at the national level. There are no models. At sector level, there might be some countries that are doing some really good things, like in Costa Rica and biodiversity. But that depends on some rich tourists from America coming and flying down to Costa Rica to enjoy the nice biodiversity in the national parks. So they can pay for all this biodiversity. So they can bribe all the forest owners, hey, take money from the tourists instead of from the logging companies. Yeah, actually, it works. So sometimes sustainable tourism can actually solve these things. But, yeah. Decoupling, you discussed this yesterday? You heard the word? Okay, usually it means that GDP, which is the gross domestic product, everything that goes around in the economy, production and consumption, it increases over time. And emissions, well, if they only increase a little bit less, it's called relative decoupling. If they actually decrease, it's called absolute decoupling. But what we need is a decrease that is sufficient to reach the Paris Agreement. So absolute decoupling is not enough. It must be absolute and sufficient decoupling. But then the question is, why should we focus on the GDP? I mean, decoupling of what from what? We know that we should decrease the use of natural resources. So what we want to reduce is some kind of pressure or impact on the environment from our activities. So that is quite clear. But what do we actually want to maximize? Is it consumption and production? I mean, this might be a reasonable approximation 100 years ago, because if you look at Europe 100 years ago, people were really desperate, poor workers everywhere, very short life expectancy. Of course, when you solve the problems of those days, you're building better houses, providing better health, providing more food and clean water and sanitation, then automatically the economy will grow. Because all these things you do, you invest in infrastructure, you invest in good water systems, public health, education, etc. So all these things mean that the economy grows. But then we're somehow confused. Okay, just because when we did this good, nice things 100 years ago, invested in human societies, and also before the Second World War and after the Second World War, when the growth of the welfare state in Europe, we've done so many good things to improve human well-being. And as a consequence, GDP also grows. But now it's like we have the different causality. We said that, oh, if GDP grows, then we get all these nice fruits. No, sorry, GDP does not produce any fruits. It's the fruits that produce GDP. So it's an investment in the things we need for our well-being that produce GDP. It's not the opposite. And there are ample of evidence countries actually increasing the GDP, but all the money goes into oil sector or some oligarchs or corruption, and ordinary people actually have a lower standard of living. Even traditional measurement of standard of living, income level, and so on, for the middle class goes down. In the US and in many European countries, the middle class has been losing. All the GDP is going up. So we have really, really stupid causality when we believe that GDP is still a good approximation of well-being. No, it was 100 years ago. But the causality has always been the same. It's the investments we do, the stuff we produce, how we organize societies to provide for our material and non-material needs. Those things produce growth as a by-effect. But I think it's the political logic saying that, oh, the more growth we have, the more taxes we have, and then we can do reforms. And even the Green Party in power now in Sweden, they say, oh yes, we want to have more room for reform. More room for reform. That means more taxes, but we cannot increase the tax percentage. So we must increase GDP, because then we can put more money into buying forests and conserving forests, and more money in to climate program, Klimatklivet or whatever it's called when you invest public-private partnerships. You help business to invest in electric roads and so on. So even the Green Party is talking in this logic. So from the science, we say that skip GDP. It's never been a goal. It was never intended to be a goal. The people who invented GDP as a measurement said that. Now, be careful now. This is a measurement of the total turnover in the economy, production or consumption. You can measure it in different ways. It should not be taken as a welfare measure. But then came Roosevelt and said that, oh, now greater prosperity for all. This is how we should measure well-being. We should spread this all over the world. So after the Second World War, we were stuck in this. And the funny thing is that the more affluent societies we have been, I mean, Sweden and most European countries are much more affluent now than 30 years ago. Well, some countries have not recovered from the financial crisis still. But otherwise, we are much more affluent. We have much better standard of living, bigger houses, more electricity, bigger cars, better education, better health, longer life expectancy. But we still work as much as before. And we produce twice as big GDP per capita as before. So when is enough? When is enough? So most of the ecological economists and other scientists in this field say that we should have a well-being measure instead, or life quality, something like that. And then we should go for this sufficient and absolute decoupling. There's no alternative, at least for the OECD countries. Maybe developing countries can be allowed to be here or there. I mean, China must of course be here, but the real low-income countries maybe can be here. But the OECD countries, they must really take responsibility that we achieve the Paris Agreement. Okay, so that's the decoupling. We want to decouple the bad things from the good things. And the good things is, of course, life quality. Yes?
Well, I would like to ask, how do you measure, or what kind of indexes or indicators to measure life quality? I mean, even though GDP, yeah, I totally agree that GDP is not a good indicator, even if GDP per capita isn't a good indicator for the economy or for the living standard. But then that's kind of indicates the one of the main factor which contributes to the life quality, income. Then how do you measure other parts of life quality if we just neglect the GDP? For example, we can say that Cuba has rather good sustainable model. However, no one says that the living quality there is good.
No,
I mean, both from every perspective.
Yeah, it's a huge question that you're asking, and there are conferences with many thousand people every year on how to measure well-being. So it's not difficult. The only difficulty is to agree on what measurement should we have. So one of the most standard measurements is called Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator. It's based on UN statistics. It was actually Herman Daly, one of the founders of ecological economics, who founded this index 30 years ago, or 20 years ago. And they measure income per capita, but they actually choose household level income. So they don't take the raw GDP, but they take the income at the household level. And then they add things, education, life expectancy, and health, etc., and other things. And you can also, and then you distract other things that are bad, environment and stress and so on, disease. And the other strands of research saying that we should go for the more subjective well-being. So we're having questionnaires asking people. At Cambridge University, they had this thing called the National Account of Human Well-being. So they asked people in 30 countries in Europe these things. And it was based on sociological research, what actually makes people be happy. So it's a mix of freedom, feeling autonomy, feeling resilience, which means you can recover after crisis, and vitality, and yeah, so you can have all this more like these things that are difficult to grasp statistically with freedom and political rights. So there were like 25 questions, and then they ranked different countries, and Denmark was top. I don't have this thing now to hear, but it's a lot of research, lots of things going on, and OECD is quite active. There have been conferences that have enrolled Amartya Sen, who is Nobel Prize economist, and Joseph Stiglitz also got the Nobel Prize in economics. So these two guys, they were leader of the OECD working group, and they provide, yeah, do like this. And then the funny thing is, nothing happens. So there are these alternatives suggested being out there, but the governments don't pick them up. It's only Bhutan who pick them up. And then there's New Zealand. The Prime Minister saying that, yeah, we should measure natural capital, human capital, which is education, and financial capital, which is GDP. So they try to find statistics on these three issues, which is a very, very simple, but it's good enough. Fair. Just start, do something. Because everything, all this, I'm writing a paper now with some colleagues. We are comparing 25 different measures. Many of them are proposed by universities or big NGOs, think tanks, and they have resources, and they measure these things, and it's a mix of objective figures and subjective data. And usually the Scandinavian countries come up very top level because they measure research. How much of the GDP to put in research? It's high in Sweden. How much do you put up in other public sector spendings? Like, and then, yeah, and the welfare states and the Nordic states are very high on these things. So, and then innovation is measured as how much money put in research. So of course there are all these approximations. But the problem is that there's no uptake from politicians, from governments. So I applaud the New Zealand Prime Minister, which is fantastic. I just wish that she could have taken some of these standard issues that have been discussed by research for the last 10 years instead of making a new kind of thing. But that's how it is. It's a good question. It's very important that we change. It's one of the main things in ecological economics to think about how can we change how we think of good quality of life. Because it's our thinking. When we think, when the newspapers write, oh, now GDP is only increasing by 1% in Sweden this year. Oh, damn it. Then you're indoctrinated by that kind of thinking. Instead of saying that, well, it depends what grows and what goes down. If the growth rate is a bit smaller because the government said no to the new refinery, Preem, this big oil company, they want to build the biggest refinery now again on the west coast of Sweden. And the government has just said that, well, we might want to try this thing according to the Environmental Act and the climate law. And if they say no, the GDP will go down a little bit. And we should all celebrate. But then if the government puts the money into electric cars and so on, then GDP goes up. We should still celebrate. So GDP is quite irrelevant. Yeah, please.
I was looking at the gross national happiness, and it was implemented in Bhutan, as you mentioned. And can we use this as an example for? Did it work to use this gross national happiness as a goal, or can we use Bhutan as an example?
I don't think it's we can replicate their measurement. I think there are other measurements that are more general, that suits for Europe, for example. I think Bhutan suits for Bhutan, but there are many problems for measurement. But what they did is fantastic. But I think we need the OECD to just step down, saying that this is now, we require this from all the governments in OECD, because OECD are basically all the rich countries, including Colombia and Ecuador is also part of OECD. So also some middle-income countries are part of OECD. So I'm just waiting for that kind of leadership. Okay, decoupling. Sweden looks great. Usually, this is what the Swedish government is posting around in saying, oh, we have done this decoupling, we're so fantastic. Well, 23% reduction since 1990, that's good, but it's, you know, it's so easy because the society was in such bad shape in 1990, so much oil dependence and so on. But imports and international aviation and shipping is not included. So this is a figure that we reported to the UNFCCC because the UN framework for climate change, they ask all governments to report. And then for simplicity, it's only what you produce on your territory and on your territory. So it's called territorial emissions. To be fair, the Swedish government cannot decide how the Chinese should do their production. And the Swedish economy is flooded by Chinese products. And that's why our footprint, when you calculate the consumer-related emissions, it's very, very high. Because we import so much from China. We're such extremely good globalists in Sweden. So we export all the paper and pulp and wood that is produced extremely climate smart because of regulations since back in the 80s and 90s. And also the Swedish steel, which also produced very, very smart with a small footprint. The countries who import these, they get very low consumer-related footprints because they import from Sweden. And we regulated these things 20, 30 years ago. But when we import things from China, we get a very high footprint, consumer-related footprint, because China is one of the worst countries in the world. The funny thing is that if you look at carbon, Swedish people in average have 4.2 tons carbon dioxide emissions, which is one of the lowest in Europe. If you have greenhouse gases, and then include that one other thing, it's 5.3 tons per person. But the consumer-related is 10 tons per person. In China, the average is 5 tons per person. And there are 1.3 billion people. So they have higher emissions per capita than Sweden has. Per capita. So what China is doing is very, very important for the world, and they're doing really horrible things right now. They are by far the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. So I think somehow we should be proud of earlier achievements by Swedish politics, but of course it's not enough. And we have much international aviation that is increasing still, which is an extra ton per capita in Sweden. So if we look at the figures, we're totally on the wrong track, even though we have done some good things. No, it's against capitalism. It's against, Sweden is a very...
question was whether, I don't know, like politicians or people in Sweden are trying to, are wanting to regulate what we import.
No, it's against the free trade principles and the consumer sovereignty. Idea of neoclassical economics and neoliberal politics is that consumer is sovereign, consumer is free to decide. Otherwise, I mean, you can only regulate if you have some, this is dangerous for you, for your health, or it's dangerous for the planet. But it's just, well, do you actually need all this consumption? No. You don't want government saying that. It's a big risk that, oh, it sounds like North Korea. So I think something of that is needed, actually. And you can do that with different things. The easiest way is to put a big tax on imports. And of course, they have to be justified because we are still a free trade loving country. So we have to base the tax on some kind of carbon emissions. You can calculate that. And then they should pay at least what they pay in the European Union in the emission trading systems. But in Sweden, the taxes are 5 times higher than emission trading system price. So you can actually require that kind of level of tax. And then it will be much more expensive to go to Clas Ohlson or to Jula or to Rusta or wherever you go to buy this cheap stuff. They will double the price. If I could decide, they would be like that. Decoupling as a concept is reinforcing the GDP fixation because they say that, oh, GDP should go up. So when we talk about decoupling, I think it's a nice concept, but I have to say that what goes up should not be the GDP. It should be instead, what should be? Yeah, it's coming next. Yes, change the well-being measures. And as you were asking before, we haven't yet decided which one. We can start with New Zealand if you like. But okay, so we should focus on social and environmental sustainability, regardless how GDP changes. That's the message from ecological economics. If you look at the rest of Europe, here's Europe 28, all European countries, all European Union countries. So it actually looks quite the same since 1990. It's very much thanks to Germany, actually, and the fall of Soviet Union. Because many of these countries in the former East Europe, they had really bad, low efficiency systems. A lot of waste in the coal minings and then the steel factories. So when they become more under democratic rule, people start to protest against these things. And there are environmental groups in Poland and in Romania. So democracy always results in better environment. So much of these things can be actually attributed to more democracy in Europe. And then it was a big energy event in Germany. And of course, here's the financial crisis. And then whoops, go up again as a rebound effect. But the problem here is since 2014, this has not continued. This trend has been discontinued. And it's the same thing in Sweden. Since 2015 in Sweden, emissions have not been reduced anymore. So all this belief in, oh, we can still have a growth because the economy has been growing all this time and emissions going down. Oh, come on, European Union has proven decoupling, absolute decoupling. But for the last 2 to 3 years, there is no absolute decoupling. It's only relative decoupling. And it's far away from the what we need to do, because this stops at 76%, and we must go down somewhere here. Yeah, here. So the present economic system, which is based on some kind of neoliberal politics, saying that, oh, we should not interfere too much with production or not interfere with consumption at all. Don't say to consumers that they are doing bad things. And now in Sweden, we have this flying shame discussion, you know that? Especially you are not Swedish, you fly a lot to Sweden. But I think it's quite interesting that we have a lot of more moralization about flying. As an economist, I don't think that is a solution to the problem. Which is, oh, you don't fly so much, you're flying so much, blah, 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 you are dumb, you stupid person, you are irresponsible, immoral. That's not how we solve problems. As long as it's very cheap to fly, people will fly. And then say, oh, I'm so good, I'm biking to a job. I brought it in not to show that I'm so good. I just forgot my key, so I can't lock it. But it's so easy to say, I'm doing some good things. I'm recycling my waste, so now I can treat myself and go into this trip to Croatia. It's just 1,000 kronor return flight. And the sad thing is that it's true. It just costs 1,000 kronor to go to Sadar or another nice place in the Mediterranean. Who doesn't want to go there in September or in May to leave Sweden? And if it's so cheap, we have to change this. Here's another depressing figure. Because decoupling is not only about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, it's a lot about natural resource use. Here's biomass, here's non-metallic minerals, it's a lot of sand and other things. And here are the fossil fuels, and here are the metal ores. They're all increasing at the global level. This is global level 2017, and here's actually, it's 30 billion. So it's 30 billion tons, it's 90 billion tons. So we don't have decoupling at the global scale. And the global scale is usually the best scale to measure because if one country like Sweden can show, oh, we're actually reducing our emissions, part of it is because dirty industries in Brazil are providing things for us, and dirty industries in China are providing things for us. To be fair, Sweden has its nice share of dirty industries, where a lot of steel industry, iron industry, aluminium, and paper and pulp. So we are not just doing like many other countries, just having the financial sector and some non-dirty sectors. But we have regulated these sectors very much in Sweden, and that's why we still have quite low footprint compared to other countries. But we need to get down 75% further reduction, and we're not on the track. When we are doing this smarter, when you have smarter growth, sustainable growth, you make things cheaper. You have technological innovation, which results in energy efficiency. That means that energy price decreases, which results in increased demand. So a lot of these things that we have done in our technological development has reduced our energy dependency. But that results that electricity and energy becomes cheaper. And then we use more. It's called the rebound effect. So the richer you get richer because you have higher productivity, then you can consume more. And what do we put our extra money? How do you consume this extra money? What do you do for your holidays? What do you do? Well, I have to admit, I have taken the very cheap flight to Croatia once. It was a treat for myself and my wife, because we have been so good at recycling and so on. It's so tempting. So I'm saying, like Odysseus, Odysseus, he asked his people to bind his arms around the mast when he was on this ship, and he was passing by the beautiful women singing, and said, "Oh, I'm just a man, I can't help myself, blah blah blah. So please tie my hands here, so I will not run away having sex with this what do they call the sirens." And I said, "So, and when I tell you to loosen my hands, then don't do it, because those are my primitive desires. But my true preferences, according to my value system, is that I don't want to go to the sirens. I want to, but I can't resist myself." I mean, something like that. I think it's a temptation to go flying to a warm country when you live in Sweden. And in your generation, you're used to this. When I was young, we went Interrail because it was the cheapest thing. Flying was very expensive then. But now, my son is 21, and he's a vegan, so he's one of these people. So he's, yeah, he doesn't fly actually, but in this generation they fly a lot because the prices are wrong. So how can we stop this Jevons paradox, the rebound effect? How can we stop that? We want to do things smarter, we want to having more productivity, but we don't want us to use the extra money to all this fossil fuel things. So how can we solve that? One thing is to moralize, say, "Oh, you're bad, bad, bad." The smarter way is to what? Yes, to price it. So the solution here, according to environmental economics, so this is quite standard. It's not only the ecological crowd, it's all economists who agree that we should tax fossil fuel, a BFT, big fat tax on fossil fuel, and it should be global. Per Krusell and John Hassler, who are famous professors here at Stockholm University, they always write in the newspapers, "We must have a global tax." I say, "Oh God, it's so unrealistic." In the green economy, the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, they launched the green economy 2011, and then they put the finger on the subsidies that countries pay to fossil fuel sector. Because most low-income countries, they say, "Oh, it's so unfair that poor people don't afford to drive the car, so we must subsidize petrol prices." And it's a good way to make the country mobile and to make lots of things happening. But then you invest more and more into the fossil sector. And then after a while you say, oh, a big part of the state budget goes into subsidies to the fossil fuel. And then it's too late to stop it. Because then the fossil fuel mafia becomes so rich and they take over government. And many countries become bankrupt because of the subsidies. And when they stop subsidies, people protest. Ordinary people protest. Oh, but I got used to this, buying petrol for just like 3 kronor per liter. Which is the worst country in the world when it comes to these things? When the price is like, it's less than 1 krona per liter. It's only one country in the world, it's Venezuela. They're by far the worst economic thinking in the government. They say, oh, it must be cheap for the poor people. Let's just subsidize it like this. They don't even make money on the oil. And then they have some other countries like in Qatar and other oil producing countries that have very, very low prices. But even countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, they're subsidizing. India is good. India has actually stopped subsidies. And Mexico as well. So many countries have 10 kronor per liter. That is the average when you have a decent politics. But the countries will lower the 10 kronor per liter. They're subsidizing. And then in Europe, it's like 15, 16. So then it's like a reasonable tax level. So what do we find? Sorry, here. Do we find this carbon tax? No, we don't find it. Yes.
I totally agree with you on the flying tax suggestion, but what do you say to the fact that it would become a kind of social problem as well, because then flying would only become possible for the rich people, or remain possible for the rich people, but the poor people couldn't treat themselves anymore with any nice warm places?
Yeah. Good question. I think you put the finger on the most important issue here. I think many of the environmental economists and also environmental movement like Naturskyddsföreningen have forgotten the distribution aspect of environmental politics and climate politics. And this makes it difficult for politicians. The funny thing is that when I started my career in 1990, I had my first course in this, and people were so interested. Oh, Sweden is just 1991. Sweden had launched the first carbon tax in the world. It was very, very high. And the whole world was like, what's happening in Sweden? And it was because it was 1 year before the Rio conference. So Sweden wanted to show off, saying, oh, we are the most progressive country in the world. And then there was a big discussion, but this will punish the poor people. They cannot afford driving the car anymore. So the backbone reaction by people in the environmental movement and also among the leftists was like, no, this is bad. It means that the rich people, they can just buy themselves the freedom to pollute. That's not fair. No, we're against this. And the right wing, they were like, yes, this is good, because then you use, it's called a market-based instrument. Because then you use the market for changing prices, and you actually internalize an external cost. So it's totally in the neoclassical theory. So the right-wing parties, they were pro this tax until it came, until it was implemented. Because who do you think were protesting? When the Social Democratic government imposed this tax from nothing, that whoops, because they wanted to increase the budget, increase the revenues. So who was protesting? Business were protesting, and the rich people who are the biggest consumers. And then suddenly the leftists said that, business is against this. Then maybe I should be for this, according to the logic. So what happened then? During 1 year in Sweden, the whole landscape just shifted like this. So suddenly the leftist party was the biggest proponent because it punished business and rich people. And somehow they could accept the poor people who were the real people who suffered because they couldn't afford driving the car as much. And I still think it's a mystery. I think that the solidarity might be so strong in the leftist party. or the feeling, oh, we just hit the rich people. I don't know what is the most important feeling. But it's the leftist party and the Green Party in Sweden who have the biggest support of the carbon tax. All of the carbon tax, according to science, is quite regressive tax, as you say. And regressive means that poor people are punished harder than rich people. Because poor people buy the ordinary stuff, food and these things. And rich people, they also buy these things, even more of that, but then they buy a lot of things that don't. So they are hit harder compared to tax on property or tax on capital. Then the rich people are hit harder. That's a progressive tax. So there is a discussion. And when you have the yellow vest in France, and we have the petrol protest in Sweden, it's based on this thing. But the wisdom from economists is that if you think that the problem is that poor people are poor, then you should solve that with distribution, like free healthcare and lower taxes for the poor. You should not solve that by distorting prices. The prices must reflect the true cost. And the true cost of all these carbon things is very, very high. It's even higher than the Swedish tax on carbon. So you make a bad economics if you try to solve distribution problem by changing market prices. That's a really important lesson from economics, the standard economics. But the sad thing is that we have not had a tax reform in Sweden or in Europe. Here is Europe. It used to be 7% of the shares of total taxes or 2.5% of the shares of GDP. It's actually been stable or even gone down a little bit for the last 10, 12 years. It's a scandal. So I've used this figure in different reports I've been involved in during the last years. And people are so shocked. Is this how we do in the European Union? We're supposed to be leading this transformation to fossil-free economy. We don't even use the most important tool that we have. So these are all the taxes. And in Sweden, we have the same definition of tax: energy tax, sulfur, NOx, waste tax, transportation. And all these add things to the same kind of very meager. It's the same thing as European Union. Okay, now we start again. Hello, everyone in the camera. I'm here again after some coffee. How many people are there in the camera? At least 11. Are they the PhD students or? Okay. Yeah. I promised to say something about degrowth and A-growth. Degrowth is often a catchword for sustainability transformations. Have you heard of degrowth? Yeah. Of course, it's a reaction towards our society that is very much focused on growth. So I'm involved in this research a bit. I have many colleagues. I just want to say something about the word. I think the word is a bit hard because it's like we have to degrow, and then it's very much antagonist the growth proponents. And I say, well, don't focus so much on the growth. Focus on what we have to do instead, and we have to make a transformation. I think it'll be confusing as a concept. A-growth means agnostic about growth. A-growth, like asexual. Yeah, so A-growth means that you don't care about the growth. So you can be agnostic about it because GDP is a result of both good activities and bad activities. And of course, we want the good activities, the sustainable transformations means that good sustainable investments in solar and wind and smart transportation and wastewater treatment and so on, and summer consumption must increase. And the funny thing is that everyone agrees on that. This is not controversial. Yes. More green jobs and more green infrastructure and electrified highways and more of these things. Everyone agrees on that. Okay? But that's only half of the sentence. The second part of the sentence is that unsustainable investment and consumption must decrease. people start looking at the ground and saying, but then GDP might go down. Well, it depends how much you speed up these things and how much you slow down these things. That is the result of the GDP. And if it's important for stability reasons to have a steady state, like 1 plus or 1 minus, plus 1% to minus 1% GDP, that's steady state. Then you can steer these things with the wise government and governance, given the right incentives to business and given the right regulations to business. You can steer these things. I say the net effect is not very important, but maybe I should say we should strive for a steady state. Because we know from experience that if we have a 10% cut of GDP, that means high unemployment. And that usually means social unrest. It usually means many protest people and populist and, how to say, when you have polarization. And it seems like the Western democracy cannot handle these things at the moment. So I should change this, that we should strive for steady state GDP. Here's the illustration of what I mean. Sweden has about $50,000 per capita. Today, Bangladesh is 4,200. If you imagine that you can divide this per capita GDP in unsustainable investment and consumption, light blue, and the dark blue is sustainable, then I just assume that most of it is unsustainable today because we are very fossil dependent, even though we have like 90% of our electricity is renewable. Yeah, hooray. But 100% of our consumption is consumption. And it's too much consumption. And it's a buying and throwing away waste. We produce things from raw materials, and after 1 year, most of it is waste. We don't have a circular economy, even though we talked about this for 30 years. So most of it is unsustainable because that is how the production looks like and the economic incentives. Small part is sustainable. So in a sustainable Sweden, it is the opposite. That is transformation. And then if you add these two things, compare with these two things, is this bigger or smaller? Yeah, I just made it smaller to say that, oh, it's actually degrowth. But I could make this one a little bit bigger, and then it would mean we have actually GDP growth. And the thing is, I don't care, because I want a transformation to happen, a very, very rapid transformation. It can only be done with a strong private-public partnership between industry and big business. Sorry, between government and industry, big and small business. And so the government must take the lead, because only the government has the right, has the authority to make new laws and to change incentives, to have lots of subsidies to the good things we want to do, to make real investment in railways and so on, and having taxes or prohibitions to the bad things. Only governments can do that. In Bangladesh, actually this thing is increasing a little bit. So it's not absolute decoupling, it's relative decoupling. So I say that Bangladesh might do that. And we might take responsibility in the OECD countries for absolute and sufficient decoupling. Save the climate system? Yes, please, but only as long as GDP increases. This is the message from the Swedish parliament. We were so proud saying, oh, now we have the climate law in Sweden. And the goal is no net emissions after 2045. So this was decided. The climate politics must be long-term effective in a way that reduced emissions of greenhouse gases must be combined with economic growth. That's what the parliament said. And then the question is, okay, so if we have to take measures to close down some fossil fuel infrastructure, such things, so actually the GDP would shrink. If that is the only way we have to save the climate, Oh, no. Then we cannot do it. We can only do it if it's combined with economic growth. That is the message from the Swedish parliament. And this is the climate law that the Green Party was so proud of. And I think it was a really good thing. And I think the Green Party could not do anything better, because this is the consensus. And not only in Sweden, in almost all countries, maybe except Bhutan. It's impossible to get political acceptance to say that climate is more important than growth. So even if we have to do things that reduce growth to save the climate, we should do it. We still don't have that consensus. And then, of course, it's no wonder that emissions are still increasing. And we should not fool ourselves. We still live in this extremely strong indoctrination that GDP growth is the most important thing in politics. It's more important than saving the climate. Any questions? Do you think I'm unfair? I'm not. I've been talking to so many politicians about these things. And this is what and also say that, oh, but look here, if Sweden would reach the climate targets at the expense of growth, we would not be a model for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, they want to see a model that is combining growth with reducing emissions. So we will not be a model. So we're doing better things as a model for the rest of the world. Oh, come on, who are you fooling? But so this is the answer I get when I talk to clever politicians who defend this thing. Yes, please.
Yes, actually, I think that maybe one concern from the Swedish government is that they are afraid that there won't be any investment in Sweden if they really tightens up the rules and regulations, because the world is open. If the Sweden's rules and regulations are too strict, then there won't be money flood in, and even Swedish money will just flood outside. Even nowadays, the asset managed by globally, asset belongs to Sweden is at least 5 times larger than the GDP of Sweden, and that shows something. And not to mention that once the I think the flying tax has been introduced, basically Copenhagen has become the hub. SAS has been investment heavily into Copenhagen, and Finland has been taking advantage of that. And then Swedish people, if want to travel, intercontinental travel, they probably will just per person, they might have much larger footprint, a carbon footprint. I don't know. So because this is kind of, if Swedish government really wants to reduce all those things, then maybe Sweden should be just a locked up country like Bhutan or North Korea.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you summarize the current situation very well, and that's why there's more and more talk about. Yeah, here am I. Here is the class. There's more and more talk about the financial system, and my colleagues at Stockholm Resilience Center and the Bayer, the Royal Academy of Science, having a project when they try to see who are the investors in the Amazons, for example, and who are the investors in the boreal forests. There are quite few big companies, and there are even fewer large investors like BlackRock. And how do they think about these things? And they have this logic, as you say, that if one country starting to behave in a very, restrictive way, asking for regulations and so on, the whole international capital is saying, okay, then this doesn't seem to be very secure. We go to the place where people say that we'll continue investing in all these bad things because that seems to be safe. But I think actually that politicians have been too afraid of the financial market, because when Germany did this Energiewende 10 years ago, you remember Angela Merkel, Energiewende? It was quite extraordinary that the conservative politician started this thing. She didn't start it, but she continued pushing for this thing. It was very, very high prices for electricity for the consumers, not for the companies, but very high prices that made very high prices for solar and wind power for 10 years. So the German consumers suffered a lot by paying all these bills all the time. But it was enormous transformation towards solar and wind power in Germany, and prices were going down. Thanks to all these thousands and thousands of engineers working on these things. This is what happens in transformation. You reduce cost of the good stuff when you start investing in it. Because there are more and more scientists, the more engineers working on these things. So of course there was business opportunities in the sector. Germany was just prospering all the time. Germany has not been abandoned by the financial sector just because they have done this transformation. So, and that's why I'm saying that degrowth should not be the goal. I think degrowth might be the consequence of sustainable transformation. But the goal should be sustainable transformation. And then as long as we have so many needs to do electrified railways, electrified highways, a good waste system, and we have to rebuild so much of our economy, of our infrastructure for the next 10 or 15 years. So I see no way that the economy will shrink. If it shrinks, it might be 1% or 2%, but it will not shrink like 10%. We're not coming into a recession. So a transformation does not mean a recession. And I think we can easily convince the financial sector they don't have to worry about these things. I think they're clever enough to understand that. But the fear is there. And if you read what Magdalena Andersson says, exactly the same thing. I said, so Magdalena Andersson, our Prime Minister of Finance, she said similar things to you. That, no, if we do this, then the financial sector, they might be nervous and they might leave Sweden. Oh, come on, Magdalena. They might be nervous, but not stupid. They still want to make money. And they can still make money in Sweden. Sorry? Nordea has moved. Yeah. I'm actually I'm so happy. So next time they crash, we don't have to pay it. The Swedish tax, then the Finnish taxpayers can pay it. Okay, evaluation of ecosystem services. Just a few slides to end. It's a very broad concept, valuation. Economists tend to think that valuation means putting a price tag on nature. But come on, to be honest, if 2 degrees warming, then most coral reefs will disappear, according to the last IPCC report. Do you need a price tag on that? The reason why we put price or try to estimate things in money is because we have a relation to money. We can compare it with money for what? How much is a car? How much is a house? How much is a weekend to New York? So we have in our experience some kind of concept of money. So we want to translate things to money because then we can understand it. So it's a communicative tool. But how much does it communicate? Saying that, oh, if we destroy the coral reefs, that is worth $22 billion per year. $22 billion per year. How much is that? An airplane or 10 airplanes? You know, these figures, we cannot think of them. They're so big. Or it means this much money per person per year. Okay, 500 kronor per person per year. That's not so much. Or it depends. So an economist asks people, how much are you willing to pay to have wolves in Sweden? Wolves, yeah, they're cool. Yeah, they're extinct. Yeah, it would be nice to have some wolves. And people respond. And then when you add this according to the method in economics, then you get more money than the whole budget for the EPA in Sweden. And EPA has a lot of things to do. Conservation is one part. And conservation of carnivores is another part. And conservation of wolves is another part. So of course, it is in their budget, conservation of wolves. They fly in wolves from Russia for the genetic diversity, and they make sure that they are not disturbing the reindeer up in the north, so they're in Värmland, in the middle of Sweden. Sometimes they come up to Stockholm, but then they're killed because there are some families shouting. It costs some money, and I think it's important to have wolves. They are part of the ecosystem. But come on, when you ask people for these things, people don't have a clue to see what is a reasonable price, how to value these things. And the reply I got when I tell this to my colleague, well, people must have to get used to it. That was his response. Very neoclassical environmental economist. He thinks people must get used to thinking about all this species and biodiversity in monetary terms. My gut feeling is, no, I don't think people should get used to it. I think we should communicate this on a more ethical dimension, because people understand ethics. And we can understand our responsibility for our own children and for other people on the planet. And of course, can the message from IPCC be clearer than that 95% of the coral reefs will disappear? Could be clearer than that? Anybody diving in here? Has anybody of you seen corals? Yeah, me too. I get so sad when I read this from IPCC. I start crying when I read this. So the coral reefs are disappearing. So my kids will not be allowed. They cannot get a chance to see coral reefs, perhaps in a museum. But it makes me so sad. And the price will not convey the same information. So I think price is only one way to communicate information. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it's really bad. It disguises information. So we have to be pragmatic. How can we convey the information? And monetary valuation is just one part. Commodification is when you expand market logic to more and more goods in our world. Prostitution is also commodification of love. I don't know what you buy when you go to prostitute, but it's a way that you can buy sex, you can buy love, or whatever you think that you buy. You buy it on a market. That's prostitution. So that's commodification is often used for. It was used by Karl Marx in the beginning, saying that people are commodified when they sell the labor to the employer, and then the employer is basically treating you as animal. So it's an old concept, and much of this research is actually in that kind of exploitation sense, that we exploit nature, we don't treat it with respect, it has no value in itself. It's a commodity on the market. You can just buy it and pay for it. So the question is, do we want to treat the nature as a commodity? Of course not. I'm totally against that. Nature has intrinsic values to me. And that is why commodification is a terrible thing. So I wrote my paper, but I wanted to make a more nuanced discussion, because some of these people are against commodification. They are against everything when you talk about money in relation to nature. And as an economist, I say that we have to put tax on carbon. Is that commodification? And then they can't answer. Come on. Even if you're a leftist academic and you're against this terrible thing of seeing nature as a commodity, you must be pro-taxes. You must be pro-paying farmers payments for ecosystem services. It was called miljöersättning 30 years ago when I was a student at Ultuna, at SLU. And the Swedish government did that even before the European Union entrance. We paid our farmers to produce organic food and to produce nice landscapes, because you cannot make a living in our market economy. And these things, biodiversity and nice views, it's called public goods in economic terms. It means that there are some values that I enjoy it, but when I enjoy it, it's still left for you to enjoy. It's still left for you to enjoy as much. So it's really profitable to make these things because it can be enjoyed by so many people. Compared to a banana, I enjoy it and then it's gone. You cannot enjoy the same banana. It's called private good. But a public good can be enjoyed by everyone, and it does not reduce the ability for other people to enjoy the same thing. The military defense is such a thing, and the ozone layer, biodiversity, the stable climate, and so on. So all these things the governments are for to invest in. And that's why governments pay farmers. And so I wrote in my paper that there are some low degrees of commodification. We should not be so much afraid of this. That we think of nature having use value to people. It does not take away that nature also has intrinsic value. There are still some academics who say that, oh, I don't like the concept ecosystem services. Why not? Because it's very instrumental. Yes, it's very instrumental. Yeah, it says that nature is only for people to enjoy. Okay. Do you like the concept of sustainable development? Yeah. You know, that's also anthropocentric. Sustainable development is only what human needs to resources and to nature. It's 100% anthropocentric. And also ecosystem services is anthropocentric. It's about the use that we get from using values. But it does not negate, it does not rule out that we think of nature as intrinsic value. It just adds on the intrinsic value, the moral dimension on these things. Using price signals is not the same thing as using markets. In a market, there's some kind of supply and demand that somehow finds a balance between producer and consumer. And then it's like so the market decides the price and the market decides the quantity with this balance. But when the government pays a subsidy or compensation to farmers to produce biodiversity, then the government sets the price and the government decides the quantity. Not a market, but the government is using the price signal to balance the market failures. It's called market failure because the market cannot account for public goods. Public goods is one of the classic market failures, and external cost and external benefit is the other classic market failure. So the market cannot account for these failures. Governments must help the market. So according to actual neoclassical theory, it's usually chapter 22 in the textbook. It's external cost, external benefits. Yeah, this is an anomaly in the economy. And I say, no, it's like 70% of the economy are external cost for public goods. If you look at all the things that are valued to you, love, relations, having a good upbringing by your parents, having friends, everything is external to the economy. So most of your quality of life is not in the GDP. It just happens to be like that. But it's treated in a very, very bad way in neoclassical economics, like chapter 22, because the worldview among the textbook writers are so far away from being realistic. Economics is a philosophy. It's about human well-being. Of course, we must look at what actually contributes to human well-being. And then we have to help the economy. And it is in the neoclassical theory. It was Arthur Pigou 100 years ago saying that if you don't internalize this external cost, then we will not be efficient. So it's totally within the framework of neoclassical economics, but it's just ignored by mainstream economists because there is no big demand from politicians to this kind of theory. So the good thing with environmental economists is that they picked up this thing from Arthur Pigou. He wrote this book in 1920, 100 years ago. This is basic for environmental economics. So if we want to value ecosystem services, we can have methods in monetary terms. If we actually know what we're doing. Or we can have measures in quantitative terms, mapping and status and statistics and quantifying things. When it's difficult to translate to money. And sometimes we just have to describe the effects when there's so much uncertainty. So there are three different ways of communicating the value. And this actually according to TEEB, very authoritative report, The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB. The report 8 years ago. So I used that in my paper. And here is a different, I don't have to go through all these things, but examples of the degree of commodification. When you don't give a role for price signals, and here you're putting it totally in the market. So I think the dangerous commodification is when you come up here to the 5th or the 6th degree. But here you can use, you can change the price signal to actually improve the efficiency of the market and to fulfill the goals in politics. And we should not be so much afraid. But of course, we must take care that we use the policy instruments in a good way. But that's not commodification that we should be afraid of. So that was basically my argument. And here saying that you can have information, different methods here. And there's nothing saying that these methods are more exact or better. You can actually have technical scientific mapping and GIS and so on as a good decision background. Or you can have SWOT analysis, which is more qualitative. So we should be pluralistic and accept different decision tools, and not saying that monetary are better than quantitative or qualitative. So actually the paper is arguing that valuation is very complex and we should embrace different ways. Okay, this was all. Now questions.
So I wanted to ask you about climate compensation. You mentioned this in your paper, I think, but I mean, as a consumer, you run into a lot of advertisements and commercials from big companies saying that they always climate compensate for whatever emissions they have. Do you believe in this? Does it work?
It's a good question. It's usually it's a voluntary thing for the first. Consumers who feel bad about when they're flying, then they pay to some organization saying that, oh, then we plant trees in Africa, something. Well, of course, it's better if these trees are being planted than if they're not planted. But the thing is that why should we wait? First, destroy nature in order to repair it. We should put a lot of resources into planting forests, not only in Africa, but all over the place. And it is the cheapest, according to IPCC, it's by far the cheapest way to mitigate climate change. And I think instead of being a voluntary thing, it should be actually something that is regulated. So all companies, apart from paying carbon tax, or apart from being regulated, they should also make sure that they are climate neutral. And I'm talking to Kai Turuk, who is the sustainable director of Max Hamburgers. And they're boasting, oh, we are climate neutral, we are climate even positive. But come on, Max, you cannot say that. Oh, yes, we say that. Because we're doing as good as we can. To now, we are like 40% of the hamburgers are vegetarian. Quite nice. I mean, that's an achievement, isn't it? So they're changing the norms of what is a hamburger, trying to make some delicious hamburger. They're quite nice, I think. I can easily live without. I mean, if it's so good with food, if you don't eat meat, I mean, it's not a sacrifice. And then the remaining emissions, which they cannot solve today. They're working on it, but they cannot solve it today. They are hoping to go down, but they still have emissions because they're using transportation and so on, and they are fossil fuel, and the whole infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. So then they go to some serious companies that make sure to plant forests in Africa. And they give them millions of kronor every year. And I think that should be compulsory. So I'm a bit against the idea that it is based on the moral conscience of the individual consumer. It doesn't help so much. But any money that increases the budget for tree plantation is good. So that's my pragmatic answer. As a solution, I don't think it's good. We need much more public common efforts that are regulated.
In your whole presentation, you never talked about discounting. And I had an idea that this was a favorite thing among economists, because my own bias about this is that a big problem with trying to achieve sustainability in the short term is that people don't care about future people, or they care about them much, much less than they care about themselves. And I wonder what your opinion on this is, whether this is still an issue, or if you could just comment on how this equates to your commodification.
Yeah, but Matt, you only gave me 2 hours. economists try to base the ideas of discounting on people's behavior. If people behave in a way that you discount the future, you think it's more important what happens now than what happens in 10 years or 20 years. And one such behavior is when we borrow money to buy something, to buy an apartment, to buy a house. Then we're prepared to buy this thing because we want it now, and then we pay it later. And then we're prepared to pay a bit more, we pay interest. So that's a sign of our willingness to discount the future. So we say we have a time preference doing something, having something now. It's a time preference, and it's based on pure time preference. We are short-sighted, want now, and it's also based on an idea that I can't pay now, but I can pay in the future because I will have some income in the future. So all these different things add up to the discount rate, and the discount rate is usually between 1% and 5% in economic calculations. And then it's a big debate. And Nicholas Stern, who was the former chief economist of the World Bank, chief economist of the World Bank. So he's a very, very top economist in the world. He got the job by Tony Blair 14 years ago to make a report on climate change. So he wrote a report on the economics of climate change. And he learned so much during this work. He was shocked himself. This is the biggest market failure in the world. His conclusion was the biggest market failure, which means it's underpriced. We need a big fat tax in all the world to account for this, to make the market work better. And because these things are very, very long term, we should have like 0% discount rate, or maybe 1% discount rate. Because if we have a very high discount rate, 5%, then it doesn't matter what happens in 100 years. So all the catastrophes happening in 100 years is worth nothing. But the investment cost we do now to reduce the catastrophe is very heavy. So to compare the benefits of action means that you have much reduced catastrophe in 100 years. But that's almost worth nothing if you have a high discount rate compared to the investment you do today. So he was arguing for, using good economic arguments, because he's, of course, a smart economist. But then he was opposed by William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize in economics last year. And we were so sad. Come on, Per Krusell, who is sitting here as a professor, he's deciding the Nobel Prize. He's a very influential economist in Sweden. Together with his friend, John Hassler, they're like Bill and Bull. Say, yes, it is good. Yes, it is good. Yes, Nordhaus is good. Yes, Nordhaus is good. So they always back up each other, like Bill and Bull. And they have been students to him as well. And they have learned from him. So, yeah, I'm not so fond of this. Of course, Nordhaus was the first economist who did a model of this thing, integrated assessment model. But it was 30 years ago, and today the models are much, much better. But he sticks to his old model because he did it. And it's like, hey, science is about progress. But science is also about protecting your own victories. And he's put so much effort on this thing. And it's so sad. So his former colleague called Pindick wrote a paper saying that this is bogus. This is scientific dishonesty. Because this model was good at the time, but we cannot use it anymore. He published this in a big journal, in a big magazine. Yeah, scientific journal. Yeah. So I think Nordhaus is doing a lot of damage because he still said we have 3% discount rate. It makes a big difference.
Part of the solution to this, when you talk about the coral reefs, for example, if you have an irreplaceable resource, shouldn't the discount rate be 0?
Of course.
Yeah, and the climate and the functioning of the climate system is irreplaceable.
Yeah.
But I think somehow this is never...
The only problem is that if you apply this pragmatically and you build a railway in Sweden, then you say, well, we build this railway to reduce climate change. And therefore, it should be a 0 interest rate in the investment. Then the railway will outcompete other things. And And it will still cost money to borrow money. It will still cost to borrow the money. So that's some practical things. But I think they can be solved if there's political will. And to make sure that investments are made fair, that we don't invest in the wrong things just because, oh, no, it's here interest rate according to the calculation. Because it looks much more profitable in the calculation. But I think we can also say that these things will have a higher value in the future. Biodiversity will be much more valuable. Because now when we ask people how much do you think it's worth biodiversity, we get very low valuation because people are used to it. As long as nature delivers, we take it for granted. When nature stops delivering, we understand it's valuable. And my favorite example is look at the freshwater price in Stockholm. Do you know how much it costs for 1 cubic liter? What is the price for 1 cubic liter, 1,000 liter? Anyone? For example, when you live in a villa and you get the bill, you don't see it if you live in an apartment. But if you live in a villa, you get the bill. How much is the price? Have any guess? 1,000 liters. Fresh drinkable water in your tap. 10 crowns only. Yeah, that means 1 öre per liter. 0.1 kronor per liter. Compare that with Pressbyrån when you pay 15 kronor for 1 liter or something. Yeah? But actually it's the right guess. It's only 8 crowns per 1,000 liter. And I mean, when you tell African students that, they get, oh God, I wish I had that cost in Africa. It's much more expensive in Africa, even though we have much higher salaries in Sweden. So it's enormously cheap. And that's why we waste it so much. Of course, our willingness to pay is, of course, 100 times higher. Just look at the Pressbyrån. We pay more than 1,000 times higher we pay for our drinking water in Pressbyrån. So the values will be different. So we can actually model 2% increase of the values of nature every year. And then 2% increase, 2% discount rate will be even out. That's also a way to solve that. Any more questions?
You did? Okay. So there's a question online from Marcus. Is the trade war between the US and China, which we would follow on the news the last weeks, having an impact on the environment now or potentially in the future? Are these economical conflicts a potential environmental risk?
Oh. The funny thing is that when Trump came into power and he stopped the TTIP, this transnational, not Trans-Pacific, the European investment, between the United States and Europe. He stopped that. And it was welcomed by the environmental movement because it includes a lot of ISDS, investor-state dispute settlements, all these things that multinational corporations make investments in the country, and then the government suddenly say, no, you can't not invest here because we have nature reserves. Oh, then I will claim compensation for all my future profits that are forgone. This happened. Many countries have had to pay billions of dollars to multinational corporations in mining and deforestation and so on. So the present trade agreements are giving a lot of power to multinational corporations to make sure that their investments are secure. To give it very little power to labor unions. They're saying that, oh yes, we should respect ILO conventions. But if they don't respect them, there are no sanctioning. So there are no compliance mechanisms. But there are extremely much compliance mechanisms and sanctioning if an investment is interfered with by government. And I understand that investors must have some security. For example, if I am a big investor and I invest in a country where a bit unstable democracy and something happens and then they change the rules. But there are already mechanisms for that, both nationally and internationally. In Sweden, there's something called Exportkreditnämnden who do these things for multinational corporations. So there are already, but the present trade regimes are not neutral free trade. Free trade sounds very neutral, but it's not neutral. The present free trade agreements are extremely much giving power to corporations and their security to make profits, and very little, extremely little to nature conservation and to labor unions. And this is why the biggest trade union in the UK, Steve Parker or something, he just made a speech in the European Union saying that why he is so much against these trade agreements. I'm for free trade, he says, because it generates jobs to my members, but the present agreements are totally giving away the power to the corporations. He didn't talk about sustainability, but the environmental movement talked about sustainability, and they're also against this the new free trade, like TTIP and TP, Trans-Pacific, and the CETA, the Canadian that we have now in Europe. So the funny thing is that this was welcomed by many people in the environmental movement. But Trump is, of course, not doing this because he is a friend of the environment. He's doing this for other reasons. I don't want to discuss that now. But I think it's a dangerous world when the strong powers will dictate the rules in the world. And this is what it's all about. So the strong powers, that means the United States and China, they will dictate. And the smaller powers, they have nothing to put in there. The whole idea of human rights and the whole idea of democracy is that to defend the weak people or the weak individuals against the government and against the strong individuals and the strong corporations. So everything on human rights and democracy and all these things is to protect the weak people, to give them liberty, to give them freedom, to give them some freedom from encroachment. It's called, yeah, when they don't get invaded by all this government or corporations or strong individuals. That's what human rights is about. And that is why people who voting for this right wing now don't understand. It's actually giving a lot of power to the strong people. So it's very strange that working class people vote for this. But it's the same as Hitler. Hitler got into power by blaming some other immigrants and Jewish people for all the problems. And then strong majority rule to punish the weaker people. So I think it's very dangerous with this the trade wars, because the weak countries and the weak people will lose. It's nicer to have a multilateral agreement, but the multilateral trade agreement that we don't see now must be based on this donut, the circle I showed before, on supporting human rights and staying within the planetary boundaries. But until we have an economic system within these boundaries, we cannot expect to have a trade regime. But the trade regime is driving the economic system, and as you said, the trade regime is making Magdalena Andersson afraid of, oh, they will not invest in Sweden if we implement these nice sustainable economic things in Sweden. We will be punished by the international system. So they go hand in hand, and we have to reform both at the same time. How are we doing now? One more question?
I think we have to, now we've hit noon.
Okay.
We stop.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
To say thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
For lots of thought-provoking stuff, definitely. Yeah, thank you everybody for participation and for